We'll speak about civil society and its role in the revolution. And from February 2018, Socioscope NGO, jointly with Professor Manusyan, started a project, the aim of which was to respond to the problem of space for civil society shrinking, as it was defined by many of the public interest advocates and the NGOs. In March, we carried out 24 focus group interviews and alarm. And we're not thinking that change of government could take place, but from mid-April to May, Armenia's political life underwent intensive structural change. And civil society groups played a key role in this. Civil society is understood primarily as the social interaction between the state and the economy, which contains everything that is above the private sector. NGOs, initiatives, social movements, but for purposes of this research, we're emphasizing progressive civil society, which is political. It is one of resistance, focusing on the protection of interests of different groups. What was the state of play before the revolution in Armenian civil society? We've seen a number of social political conditions which led to the mobilization of civil society around a process initiated by a political team that back then enjoyed little trust. The domestic political situation. Here, the respondents in the survey said that the transition to a parliamentary government was a means of further concentrating power in the hands of the incumbent, and therefore further shrinking space for civil society, plus rising militarism and active preaching of the military nationalistic patriotic discourse in a general atmosphere of formal democracy and relative freedom of expression that allows civil society to criticize all the system, but in a way where absorbing the social energy of resistance and limiting the possibility of any true, genuine systemic change. But all the talk and the criticism and the failure should have been seen as building up the experience of struggle and expanding space for the civil society's struggle. It happens when opposition is in time not seen as an actor of political change. It's considered non-existent or superficial. Civil society, therefore, was seen as a place where policy could be made. Shrinking space was also affected by the interests of Russia, local large businesses, and state financial allocations that encouraged the conservative ideology, the paternalist morals, against the protection of public interests. Within civil society, too, there was some tension. Activists, NGOs, donors, relationship. In the last few years, groups of activists and some NGOs were criticizing the situation where the international donors, financial dependency on the international donors defined the agenda of civil society. In the last 2 years, there was growing disillusionment in civil society, and in our research we often called it the period of dead activism. Despite the conflict, though, with which the NGOs were discussed in the pre-revolutionary period, it becomes important to look at this communication where NGOs were acting more radically and activists were tapping into the institutional resources of the NGOs. As to the NGO-donor relationship, they expected civil society, to sit around the table and to negotiate constructively with a view to maintaining the status quo. The large Western donors were not avoiding the financing of Congos as a policy of balancing, a balancing act. But there was also, through NGOs, a policy of influencing the NGOs. What also mattered was how civil society representatives saw the methods of response that they could engage. This pre-revolutionary situation can be characterized as a search for a mechanism to respond. There were different strategies at that time. On the one hand, civil society representatives thought that it's necessary to limit and to stop their activities altogether and to reconsider their existence and their meaning and self-education and to think of new methods to fight. On the other hand, thought of the need to continue the activities and the process as a method of resistance. Civil society representatives thought that it was necessary to speak publicly of marginalization. They spoke within their community and among the donors and to create networks of confidence so they could operate in these networks of confidence, raise problems in different platforms. In a way, looked like a party of desperate friends. And finally, considering the pre-revolutionary concerns of civil society, but the pressure politics, the revolutionary process showed that the political situation changed in ways that could not be predicted, which created new forms of cooperation that had not existed before, that in turn led to a greater prospect of political change. Thank you. Thank you. This presentation goes on. Good afternoon. As my colleague already said, presented the pre-revolutionary context. We saw that in Armenia's political environment, civil society had become the public domain where, despite the tension, and actually owing to the tension, it was possible to develop the policies and practices of the struggle. And this is what made it possible, in our opinion, to promote the avant-garde group, join the revolution initiative. In the meantime, at different episodes of the rivalry, the progressive civil society resistance groups had gained experience and formulated actions, practices of challenging authority, which were based on volunteerism. They were horizontal, coordinated self-organization, inclusiveness, solidarity, efforts and proactive participation of each individual through collective action. As you see, these principles largely entered the revolution process thanks to the leadership efforts of the Coordination Center, which ensured network mobilization that was unprecedented for Armenia. To remind you, the closest precedent was the 100-drum movement against the transport fare increase proposal in Yerevan. members of which were now professional activists, including Lenin Azaryan. Subsequent experience showed that with mutual exchanges between civil society and political actors, the civil society actors became important in framing the agenda. Cognitive involvement of society, NGO members, new young initiatives became involved. The formal and informal networks between the sides became mobilization structures, and in virtual platforms, Facebook and Telegram, they were self-organizing and influencing larger public groups. By the way, unlike the West and the crisis, the street movement coordination was supported by these tools, by these social networks. In Armenia, the civil initiatives are voluntary, decentralized. They follow the same set of principles, and they've over 10 years of successful experience. Based on their own experience, practices have developed and have been defined and redefined. The human rights discourse that emerged earlier became widespread, and somewhat leftist ideas emerged with respect to the protection of public interests. The leftist discourses and practices played a key role in the Armenian Revolution, as they integrated or even rivaled against the human rights discourse and the more traditional national liberal discourse. In the framework of this discourse, important actions of the mobilization strategy included the interferences with the work of the speed cameras and temporary occupation of public buildings, coupled with the blocking of the streets and the traffic, refusal or urges to refuse to pay utility fees, not at a large scale, but it had quite a large number of followers, so many that radical solutions had to be avoided by companies like Armbru's, Gazprom. The innovation was not just performative, it was also ideological, and it manifested questions about the elite, the political and economic elite, and it demonstrated the aspiration to establish power of the people. Parallel to the national liberal discourse, the ruling elite was questioned about leftist views of justice and fairness. What mattered was not only democracy, anti-corruption policies, but the creation of equal conditions for people to live as equals. We saw some interesting campaigns, such as the refusal to buy from the supermarkets chains owned by oligarchs, or women's groups questioning patriarchy. They also called for protection of the marginalized groups. Another important aspect of mobilization was the fracture in reality, the gap between the reality and the reality that was portrayed. From 2016, political power was concentrating more in Armenia. Civil society was put under more pressure, space was shrinking. After the April escalation in 2016, it was covered up by willingness to engage in reform, and the smoke screen of the need to be united against foreign threats. The nation-army concept that brought the power pyramid together was starting to fall apart, and its narrative was reconsidered. Tools were used to ensure that movement participants were visible. For the same purpose, campaigns were held throughout the country. School strikes, street blockades, concurrent circulation of information on dozens of events in the social media represented the attempts of the repressive regime to put pressure. My time is up, so I will quickly sum up. All the activities that we can see as performances were really based on a strong ideological foundation. Having heard Varam, we can already demand that the social requirements, political demands of all these groups are incorporated in the political programs of the current and future governments. I want to be a bit more optimistic, because there is pessimism and criticism and demands, which allows me to present actively. Social groups are not tired. They're not just sitting in front of Facebook. They're actively engaged, will engaged in forming the government and the political project. And I share Varam's opinion that if such actions are not carried out, we will fail the revolution. Thank you.